Greetings to all and welcome to IPBES. My name is Anne-Laure Gaudry. I'm the Executive Secretary of IPBES, and today we're going to talk about the topic of transformative change. As some of you may know, the governments who are members of IPBES have asked us to explore this topic. So this is day one of a 3-day online conference to start really brushing out the contours of what a future report of IPBES on transformative change could address, the type of questions that it could respond. In a moment, I will invite our speaker for today, Kai Chan, to take the floor to introduce those 3 days and then to focus on day one and on what he proposes to talk about today. But first, I would like to really bring everyone to the same level of understanding regarding IPBES, what it is, what it has accomplished during the first work program, and where that topic of transformative change fits within the new work program of IPBES up to 2030. So, as many of you will remember, and I'm hoping that everyone can see my slides here, it all started as follows. So when IPBES released its global assessment in May 2019, we already were ending the first work program of IPBES, but IPBES was born much earlier. The idea had been around for some time, but in 2005, two important events took place. The first one was the release of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment and the realization that the community did not have a mechanism to repeat this exercise, and also did not have a mechanism to directly involve governments like IPCC had been doing already for quite some years. And the second event that took place was the hosting by France, at the time President Chirac, of a major conference where the President of France called for an IPCC-like mechanism for biodiversity. That triggered a long consultation around the world, which in the end led to the establishment of IPBES in 2012. As you can see here, that is the mission, which is to strengthen knowledge foundation for better policy through science. The objective is to inform decision-making thanks to policy-relevant science. IPBES has completed its first work program and is now moving into the second, or as we call it, the work program up to 2030. We are an intergovernmental organization, meaning that our members are governments. We have more than 130 at the moment, and we have privileged ties, which we called collaborative partnership agreement with 4 UN agencies, as you see here, and IPBES is hosted by Germany in Bonn. So just really a few quick words about the first work program. So during this first work program, IPBES really focused all of its efforts to establish the knowledge base for decision making, and it did this by publishing a number of assessments. It started in 2016 with the assessments of pollinators and pollination and food production, as well as an assessment of methods related to scenarios and models. Then in 2018, 5 reports were released, 4 regional assessments of biodiversity and ecosystem services, and 1 assessment of land degradation and restoration, and a bit earlier this year, a global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services. But IPBES did much more than synthesizing and assessing knowledge. In the process of doing this, and in addition, to this, IPBES also came up with a number of innovative approaches. It started with the innovative conceptual framework, which really promotes an integrative approach to all of the work that IPBES does. IPBES does not only focus on documenting status and trends of biodiversity and of nature, but it also looks at the impact of these changes on the contributions that people derive from nature, also looking at consequences on the quality of life of people. It also looks at the causes of these changes, direct and indirect, and importantly, options for action. This is what this innovative conceptual framework means. IPBES also came up with a new approach regarding indigenous and local knowledge, which was fully implemented in the context of the global assessment of biodiversity and ecosystem services. There is also an ambitious capacity building program allowing, for example, early career scientists to participate in the production of assessments in particular, and a method to assess knowledge gaps and to work hand in hand with research funding organizations so that these gaps are addressed and new knowledge produced for future IPBES assessments in particular. So in this 5 years of the first work program, a large community has been contributing, has been active, the governments making the IPBES membership, hundreds of scientists themselves giving their time, volunteering their times and their ideas, a massive amount of scientific publications as well as other knowledge products have been analyzed, and the community at large has been involved through the very important peer review process that are so crucial in improving the quality of and the relevance of what IPBES does. So I share with you some of the impacts that this global assessment in particular has had. It started, of course, when the assessment was released, and you can see that since that assessment was released, more than 30,000 press articles have been published worldwide in many countries and many languages, but that this continues, and on a weekly basis there are still news articles that feature the global assessment and that continue to appear around the world, including social media, with new people now also embracing the cause of biodiversity, people who had been active and known more for their engagement regarding climate change. These are some of the impacts of IPBES assessments, in particular the global assessment. IPBES experts have been called upon to testify in front of quite a few parliaments around the world, France, Germany, the US, Wales, and others. The G7, triggered by the global assessment, placed a major emphasis on biodiversity for the first time, and there are many other examples, some of them of new laws where the impact of the IPBES global assessment was direct from the global assessment directly to a new piece of legislation. So after having established all of this knowledge base, the plenary this past May approved a new work program, which is called the IPBES work program up to 2030, as you can see here. And the objective now is going to shift more towards informing action, in particular informing transformative change, which really is bringing us closer to the topic of today. So the plenary agreed to activities centered around 3 prioritized topics. The first one is this Nexus ideas, where a future assessment would look at how to simultaneously reach the sustainable development goals related to food, health, water, climate, and biodiversity, and thanks to biodiversity. The second one is about this transformative change, understanding the underlying causes and determinants of transformative change. And the third one is about business and biodiversity, to understand the impact of different business sectors on biodiversity and how to measure that impact, which is something that is called upon by business and industry. And so, of course, today we are focusing on the second one here, the transformative change topic. The road to 2030, the new IPBES work program addresses the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. And concretely, in terms of the IPBES work program, some important points include the following. The new work program is referred to as rolling, and by that, the governments mean that in addition to these three priority topics, there will be a call later on in a few years for additional topics. In other words, not all topics are fixed at the beginning of this period going to 2030. The second important point is that everything that IPBES does, including this request regarding transformative change, is 100% based on requests from governments and multilateral environmental agreements and other stakeholders. IPBES works quite a bit with these multilateral environmental agreements because they really group requests from many governments. And the transformative change assessment, for example, is one that has been, among others, requested by the Convention on Biological Diversity. And third, as always with IPBES, IPBES produces assessments, but all of the other activities that I mentioned earlier are part of that, and that includes work on indigenous and local knowledge, but also work on capacity building and also on knowledge gaps. So, and this is my last slide here, coming to this online conference now. Our journey towards the transformative change assessment, it should read here. We are here with this PreScoping conference, this 3-day online conference with all of you starting today. And our objective with these 3 days is to start collecting a broad diversity of input from all of you coming from very diverse horizons. So we call it really PreScoping. It will be very broad. It will be a very diverse set of views and opinions. And we would like, if possible, to focus your interventions on what you would like this future assessment to address in terms of questions. So we would be collecting all of this. We are registering this, we are taking notes as well. All of that would go in the form of a report to the experts who are going to be selected to sit down at a scoping meeting, which will take place in April 2020. The call for experts has been open since August. We are in the last days, and so if you are interested to be considered for selection, please apply ASAP. And this small group of experts would produce a report for IPBES 8 plenary. That would be a roadmap for that transformative change assessment, proposing a set of chapters, proposing content for these chapters, proposing a budget, a number of experts, everything that one would need to know in order to be able to start that assessment. And based on that, IPBES 8 in February 2020 would then consider the report and consider also approving it and initiating the assessment. And the assessment would then start and continue. It is currently envisaged that it would be a 3-year exercise, which would start with a call for experts to perform the assessment. So this is it in a nutshell in terms of how we plan to proceed for this transformative change assessment. This pre-scoping is an innovation. It's an additional step that we have taken now in this new work program in order to really allow a larger amount of people to have a say in the overall scoping and definition of this future report. So that ends my opening remarks, and I hope that with this, it now really allows everyone to have a good understanding of where we are with this conversation today on transformative change. And I'm now coming to introducing our first speaker for day one. We will have one speaker every day. Our first speaker is Kai Chan. He is a professor at the Institute for Resources, Environment and Sustainability at UBC, which is the University of British Columbia. This means that it currently is for Kai something like 5 in the morning, and so we have to thank Kai profusely for getting up at this ungodly hour and speak about transformative change. Kai is very motivated about transformative change, and Kai's interest is really to understand how social ecological systems can be transformed, and as he always says, to be both better and wilder, better including considerations of justice. And so what I would like, and I should mention also that you have been a coordinating lead author for chapter 5 of the global assessment among your many activities. And that was the chapter that was dedicated to pathways toward a sustainable future. A very exciting chapter that has attracted a lot of press and attention. And so with this, I would like to ask you to, in the order you prefer, to introduce the overall plan for those 3 days, and then to also after or before introduce the topic for today, which I believe will also include some highlights of the IPBES global assessment. I will add, and to finish, that after that, we will have about an hour and a half or so maximum for questions, which could first focus on clarification, questions to you on your presentation, and after that, we could move to the more substantial discussion on future possible content and topic for the assessment. So I leave it at that, and now I invite you, Kai, to present. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And I'm going to start sharing my screen here. And that was not what I was hoping to do. Hold on one second. Benedict warned me that that might happen. All right.
There we go.
Here we go. So it's a real pleasure to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everybody in your different time zones around the world. It's great that we can do this in a way that is almost carbon neutral, given the amount of travel that so many of us do for these purposes. We're going to talk today about transformative change as system change. And this is one part of this 3-day conference, but it's the part that really introduces the whole of the 3 days. So I'm going to set it up, what we mean by transformative change, how we're thinking about it as system change. And then day 2 is going to focus more on what to change And day 3, we'll think about how to lever that change. And so I'll explain more about what those two mean. The first part, we have thought of it about that in the, what to change, we have thought about in the context of the global assessment in terms of leverage points. So points in the system that are particularly powerful for enabling a system-wide change. Of course, we'll revisit all of this as we go on once we've defined what we mean by transformative change. So I want to thank the other authors who were part of the Chapter 5 effort. Here are many of their names. There were lots of great contributions, and a really important effort to bring those together into a group piece that represented a wide range of views. I'm breaking up today's presentation in terms of 3 parts. So the first is why transformative change, and there we will follow the arc of the global assessment with more detail about the content in that assessment. And then what transformative change actually constitutes, and then how to think about transformative change and its elements or constituents. Anne already mentioned the kind of press that followed from the global assessment. Much of that press entered with the stark reality of where we are in terms of the threats posed to biodiversity. But a really important part of much of the coverage was the need for this transformative change. So where did that actually come from? The global assessment had 6 different chapters. The first was an introduction to the whole, really just kind of conceptual framing for the rest, that also kind of set the stage conceptually and also in terms of the historical context. The second was really most of what the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment did, all in one chapter: the status and trends of nature in the context of biodiversity and other ways of understanding it, the contributions of nature to people, or nature's contributions to people, which includes ecosystem services, and then the drivers of change to all of those. Chapter 3 took stock of the progress and prognosis towards the Aichi targets, towards the Sustainable Development Goals, and to other relevant goals and targets. Chapter 4 then reviewed what they called all plausible futures, but really it was scenarios and models that were projecting forward from the current day about the status and trends again, or the status of biodiversity and ecosystem services. Chapter 5 followed from that, recognizing that those models in Chapter 4 and the scenarios, many of those were not transformative in nature. And then as it became apparent to us as Chapter 4 proceeded, that many of those scenarios and models did not actually achieve the full set of goals and targets within the Aichi process or from the Sustainable Development Goals. And Chapter 5 was there to make sure that even if the business as usual and the variations that were represented in those scenarios and models, even if they did not achieve that kind of a sustainable future, that we would still have a chapter that took stock of that. And so Chapter 5 did a combination of things. It reviewed, it took a mostly backcasting approach in the sense of rooting this understanding of the future, not only in the present, but also in the achievement of that future state. And then thinking about the trajectories of getting from the current day to those possible future states that could be considered sustainable in terms of achieving those goals and targets, albeit late in some cases. The Aichi targets are maturing next year, right? And so those might not be feasible, but the biodiversity framework emerging from the Convention for Biological Diversity over the 2050, that perhaps could be achievable. Chapter 6 followed from that with thinking about policy options, obstacles, and opportunities. These aren't the names of the chapters, they're but the short forms for how you could understand what they do. As Anne said, it was Chapter 5 that I had the pleasure of leading, the Pathways Towards a Sustainable Future. Now I'm going to go very briefly through the arc of the argument about the global from the global assessment in terms of characterizing that first topic of why do we need transformative change? Well, the first part of that answer comes from looking at the tree of life and the threats that are the magnitude of the threats that tree of life is facing. You can here see a breakdown of some of the major groups of organisms by their level of threat. We're not going to go into detail about any of these slides. This is just a little bit of a teaser in a sense. So some groups you can see here have relatively few, but still a significant proportion of species that are at various levels of threat. Others, like the amphibians, dicots, conifers, and especially cycads, have a substantial proportion of species that are at various levels of threat, including a substantial number that are at a critical endangered level. Now, of course, many of us are keenly aware of the fact that this is not only about biodiversity, right? It's also about those nature's contributions to people. One important example of that is animal pollination, which was the topic of an earlier IPBES assessment, where 91 of 107 of the leading crop types rely on animal pollination, and the value collectively across those pollination services for all those crop types is estimated to be somewhere between $235 and $577 billion per year. So clearly these ecological impacts that are threatening biodiversity also have other really important consequences for people in the form of pollination, but also in the form of pest control, flood mitigation, building of soils, regulating freshwater, etc. Here you can see a figure from the IPBES Global Assessment that reveals the trends across a 50-year period from 1970 to 2020 of what has happened in that period for the 18 categories of nature's contributions to people. Again, we're not going to go into the details, but just to recognize that despite the efforts across a wide range of environmental initiatives, including those that started around 1970 with Endangered Species Acts cropping up in various places, in environmental impact assessment processes, etc. Despite all of those efforts, we see decreases or substantial, partial decreases in many of these categories of nature's contributions to people, with positive trends only for 3 material and ecosystem services or nature's contributions to people that involve substantial human inputs, like agriculture, for example, where this is actually one of these metrics for agriculture. See, there are multiple metrics for many of these categories of nature's contributions to people, and sometimes they disagree, but one metric here is the proportion of arable land that's actually being farmed. The next question that the global assessment asked was whether the world is on track to meet the global goals for nature and for sustainability. As I mentioned before, this was considered both in the context of the Aichi biodiversity targets from the Convention on Biological Diversity, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals of the UN more broadly. Again, we're not going to go through this in any great detail, but here are the 20 Aichi targets, and then multiple metrics representing sub-targets. So again, you can see that across it's these columns of poor progress or moderate progress, which is some progress but not sufficient to meet the goals, or good progress, which means on track to meet the goals. You see that there's actually a small proportion of these targets where we have made substantial progress such that we're on track to meet them, those targets. And so for the vast majority of these targets, what we're seeing is an ongoing kind of escalation, and in many cases, of the negative pressures that are facing biodiversity, and then other kinds of drivers, with status trends being a little better, but really few really bright spots. One of the major ones being protected and conserved areas, where that's where many nations have put their efforts in terms of ensuring a certain proportion, 17% to up to 12% of the land base, 10% the oceans. So the next point is that the changes to nature are unfortunately having a negative effect on the world's ability to meet the Sustainable Development Goals. And so here you can see the columns representing how the changes in nature are causing a decline in the support for these Sustainable Development Goals, or partial support for those goals, or unknown. And in many cases, there's poor or declining support. In some cases, there is partial support, but there were no targets where there was a real substantial improvement in the support for those Sustainable Development Goals. So this is the work that nature is doing towards those goals. Now, I don't have a slide for chapter 4, but as I said, or as I alluded to earlier, basically that was a depressing finding, that the various models and scenarios do not suggest that we are on track, or even quite close to being on track to that sustainable future that is envisioned in the context of those various targets and goals. And so in chapter 5, we undertook an iterative expert input process to identify an initial set of levers and leverage points. So with this framing of transformative change to sustainability, I'll explain all this in more detail in the next few minutes, which included a parallel process that was iterative between these two different parts, with 3 rounds of peer review for both parts and the whole. The first of those was a Nexus analysis of scenarios. So here you can see the parallels to the Nexus assessment. I'll explain a little more about that. And then the second part was a set of expert-led literature reviews that was specifically focused on the levers and leverage points for transformative change. In the workshops, we refined these levers and leverage points. We lumped, we split, and we amended those to make them, to consolidate them so that they made sense. Each of those levers and leverage points would make sense across a wide range of different contexts. We split them up to make sure that substantially different ideas were represented separately, and then we amended them such that it better reflected the evidence base that we consulted in these literature reviews. The Nexus analysis took the form of an analysis of how the various goals that we have for the planet might be achieved together, given that many of these goals entail interactions between human activities that sometimes undermine each other, right? And so we grouped them into 6 different focal points. You can see them all here. Effectively, it was to grow food, both on land and in the oceans, while conserving, and to resource cities, while conserving nature, mitigating climate, and maintaining fresh water. Those are the 6 different focal points that follow the way that the literature is basically organized. Unfortunately, there are also they're intended to specifically identify those interactions, the negative trade-offs, right? The way that we phrase them here. For example, balancing food protection from the oceans and coasts with nature protection. But there are also interactions across these focal areas. So we reviewed those, the scenarios and pathways that addressed these different focal areas with a special eye towards those that didn't also undermine other focal areas. So from that, we can conclude that the kinds of solutions that we have been focused on through the Convention on Biological Diversity, the ones that receive most of the nation's attention and the green signals of some progress, were really about conservation and sustainable use. Really crucial measures, but not sufficient to meet the task of achieving that sustainable pathway. And that sustainable pathways actually uniformly addressed the demand side. So the amount of consumption, the nature of that consumption, for example, and waste, and then also the structure of our institutions that govern those activities on the land base. Another insight was that consumption patterns are a fundamental driver of the pressures that then subsequently affect nature and its contributions to people, but that those consumption patterns are themselves driven by other factors. Behavior change was pervasive across all of these pathways and is relevant to all aspects of transformative change, including, of course, the demand side, the changes to the structure of institutions, as well as the conservation and restoration on the ground or in the water. Inequalities and inclusiveness are key underlying problems to be addressed that can hamper all other efforts to achieve sustainable pathways. And then larger structural issues, including infrastructure and as I said, the structure of governing institutions underpin all of these factors above. So governance instruments and approaches are fundamental. So this resulted in the global assessment pinpointing 5 different levers and leverage points. This is actually not the final wording for all of them, which will be released soon. And as you can see, so we're not going to get into these details of these levers and leverage points, but just to see the kind of the way that it was envisioned, that these levers, so like restructuring incentives and including subsidies and building capacity as the first of those levers, and then 3 different levers that address management and decision-making in terms of cooperating across sectors, acting preemptively or in a precautionary manner, and then making decisions adaptively as appropriate in the context of the resilience of systems and uncertainty about those systems. And then strong environmental law and the implementation, the consistent implementation of law more generally. Those levers then addressed multiple different leverage points, or points in this global social ecological system that are most powerful in terms of trying to leverage transformative change. Where transformative change is defined as non-marginal change across multiple different sectors of, and I'll actually define that better on a different slide where I have the text. Those include embracing diverse visions of a good life, which is a major driver of consumption patterns, reducing total consumption and waste, where total consumption includes not only per capita consumption, but also human population growth, unleashing values of responsibility that are already widely held in the form of collective and organizational action, and then so on. Now, I'm not going to go into more detail about that because we don't have time. Chapter 5 of the assessment also considered how those different levers and leverage points could be assembled together in a synergistic form in order to accomplish that transformative change, which is a fundamental system-wide reorganization across technological, economic, and social factors that includes paradigms, goals, and values. And so, a conclusion of the global assessment is the necessity for that kind of transformative change in order to protect nature and also secure that nature for the sake, partially for the sake of maintaining human prosperity going into the future. So here is a figure that just represents some of the potential synergistic interactions between those levers and leverage points. The levers are in orange and the leverage points are multicolored around the notion of a global sustainable economy. I don't want to go into more detail about that, but hopefully you'll be able to read about that in the global assessment. In terms of discussion points, it's important to acknowledge that within the context of this analysis that we did within Chapter 5, there was no objective way to assess those levers and leverage points. It's obviously an element of subjectivity had to enter in terms of how we identified those priorities. Those levers function very broadly, not only on the leverage points, which is the LPs here, but also on many other points in the social ecological systems. Political will is crucial in terms of helping to implement many of these changes, but it too can be built through pressure on these levers and leverage points by other actors within these systems. Argue that existing initiatives could benefit from a levers and leverage points perspective in terms of understanding how some of the changes that have been called for, like many of the Aichi targets, for example, which have resisted change thus far, could benefit from thinking about the levers and leverage points. There are a few important gaps in terms of the existing landscape of interventions thus far. We argue that the values have played a relatively limited role in terms of how people have envisioned that they could contribute to a more sustainable future. Many people identify values that need to be changed. And in the global assessment, we recognize that actually there are many powerful values that are already shared quite broadly that could themselves leverage the transformative changes that seem to be necessary for biodiversity and for ecosystem services or nature and its contributions to people, but they have not been leveraged yet. In the reform of incentives, including subsidies, is a really important ongoing need. It has resisted change despite efforts within the Aichi process and the Sustainable Development Goals. There has not been much attention, really, to the structure of governance institutions to make them more adaptive to the kinds of social ecological systems that we're faced with. And finally, many behavior change programs that have been proposed remain impeded by various elements, including a lack of important infrastructure or institutions or an inappropriate kind of structure to those institutions that prevents the broad collective action that seems to be necessary. It was thrilling to bring these findings to Paris in IPBES 7 when the summary for policymakers from the global assessment was presented. Here's a picture of some of the co-chairs, Eduardo Bronzizio and Sandra Diaz, as well of the assessment, that is, as well as Bob Watson, who was co-chair of IPBES at the time, he and Nego, and then myself and other coordinating lead authors, negotiating this text that made some very controversial points, right? This paragraph up here in question was really in question. It was about the notion of a global sustainable economy and what that might involve. And it was highly controversial. Nations were concerned about what they could say about these various elements, such as the need to reform subsidies. That word was is of some concern, right? About the need to overcome vested interests from various, sources that would oppose that kind of transformative change, for example, as well as many other factors about consistent international taxation, etc. At the end of the day, the nations did sign on to some of the most powerful messages coming out of the global assessment. But we must not pretend that that statement of support in the form of the Summary for Policymakers and the nations signing on to it means that that kind of transformative change will automatically unfold. There are multiple really important obstacles. Pointing, as we did in the Summary for Policymakers and in the global assessment as a whole, to the opposition from vested interests, which includes some interests within businesses, as well as some interests within some governments, or even possibly some interests within many governments, that those elements are actually standing in opposition to some of the kinds of transformative changes that need to take place. Of course, there are other elements within all of those institutions that are pushing for transformative change, but we have to recognize the magnitude of this challenge. And another point that I want to make is that the actual execution of a transformative change project is not the project of IPBES, right? IPBES is not poised to be that kind of an advocacy or activist organization, right? What we are talking about here is an assessment of the state of the science in reference to what transformative change might look like for those parties that want to take it forward. And so, in recognition of that, some of the authors of the global assessment and I banded together to start this kind of separate initiative that came out of the global assessment, but was an effort to kind of consolidate the citizens' concern for some of these issues about the need for a global sustainable economy and the transformative changes toward that. And so please recognize this kind of distinction between the official work of IPBES and then our own kind of, separate concern that we want to bring into actual efforts towards those changes that are envisioned, right? So if you are concerned about these issues, as just one example, but as one particular example in terms of the call for transformative change, I would invite you to visit this page, see what kinds of changes we're calling for, and to note that this is not at all the conclusion of transformative change, but rather just one step in terms of helping people to understand what that change might mean, and to help to organize a kind of citizen effort to push for that kind of change. So, I'm actually going to go over this really briefly in terms of what it entails, implementing various components of global sustainable economy, reining in the kind of power of businesses and overcoming vested interests via enhanced and strategic civic and consumer action, where that civic action is informed by an unbiased distillation of very complex and contentious science, and then unleashed by new supply chain solutions in the form of consumer actions, recognizing again, this is not the end, but a beginning. So here are some sources that are relevant for this thinking about the role of values. And then, here at the end are a couple of the references that are pertinent both for the chapter and then for the summary for policymakers. At this point, I'm just about ready to take some clarifying questions, but before I stop sharing the screen, maybe it makes sense to take questions while I'm still sharing if I need to go back, or maybe, I'm not sure, maybe I'll leave that to the Secretariat to guide me. But just as some questions for provocation, or possibly we can think of these as topics that might structure the questions or the discussion going forward. We might think about what kinds of systems need to be changed or could be changed or would naturally be changed as part of transformative change. So how even to think about that? One might think about legal systems, policy, political systems, economic systems, and then of course ecosystems as well. Second topic that we might engage is how do we recognize when the changes are actually transformative as opposed to more marginal or incremental? And then another topic might be, must all changes to levers and leverage points be dramatic in affecting a kind of transformative change across the system? I think no. Personally, just as a really brief answer, I don't think so, but we might talk more about when those changes or for which levers and leverage points they might need to be dramatic and for which they might not. So again, to just circle back to the next 2 days, the way that we envisioned this was that we might pick off the separate topics of what needs to be changed from how those changes might be affected, which roughly follows the thinking of leverage points in terms of what needs to be changed. So those elements of the system that do together, collectively, ideally synergistically, affect a kind of transformative change across the system. And then the levers that are the kind of interventions, as it were, that might enable that. So hope that you will also be involved in those various efforts.